Hello folks, welcome to the final lesson of Social Studies 7. We've been traveling all throughout the centuries of Canadian history, and today's lesson is very heartwarming because it looks at two topics, two themes that are a huge part of Canadian identity today, and those are bilingualism and multiculturalism. And I can tell you in less than a minute what both of those are, and then you can tune out. But if you did, you would miss the best part, which is the story about how we got here. Because today, in a survey, in several surveys, Canadians, both English and French, have largely expressed support for both bilingualism and multiculturalism, particularly the French Canadians with that bilingualism. Official bilingualism means that you have access to all federal government services in both English and French. So that includes accessing any kind of government information, having any kind of federal legal issues. The different provinces have different official languages. New Brunswick is the only province that has both French and English as official languages. So the services you might get in a provincial court can vary by province to province. In addition to federal government services, bilingualism also covers education and the right to having education in your official language of choice. And so if you are a French speaker, in Alberta, for example, most people speak English. But if you're in a community that has 5,000 or more French speakers, or a smaller community but at least 5% of the population, you have the right to education in French. Similarly, if that's the case in Quebec, they have a few little exceptions to that rule. You'll look at that in ninth grade social studies. But if you have a large Anglophone or English-speaking community, you have the right to an English education. And actually, if you are an English speaker, that is your first language, and you want your kids to continue having English education, there's no stopping you. You have the right to that education. So that's what official bilingualism means. It's not about everyone must learn English and French, because actually less than half the population, not anywhere close to half the population, is fluently bilingual in both of our official languages. But the purpose is that no matter which one of those you speak, you should be able to get by in our country. With multiculturalism really has two parts to it. It's acknowledging the fact that we are a multicultural society, that we have many different ethnicities, and that we honor and celebrate them. We're not forcing everyone to be either French or English. We are acknowledging and happy, and that's part of our Canadian identity, that we have so many different identities in our country. And officially, as far as government policy, our government has also made efforts to promote and celebrate and support these different ethnic communities in preserving and promoting their culture. And so we often see all our different political leaders attending different religious events, different ethnic festivals, like when they have Kwanzaa, or recently there was a Muslim holiday that took place, and all the political leaders were tweeting, hope you're having a good time, despite the fact that you're stuck in your homes. So how did we get here? Was Canada always this way? Because no, when we looked at the beginning of Canadian history, it was good old John A. Macdonald, and he was saying we're British subjects, and the French Canadians said we don't really like the Queen, but we're French. And then we got all these immigrants coming in, and we saw that some of them were treated better than others. But how did we get to the place where we are celebrating all this diversity? Because as a matter of fact, in the 2016 census, over 252 ethnic groups were identified when people asked, what ethnic group are you in? Or to which ethnic group do you belong? The top one was people just said Canadian. About 11 million out of 35 million said Canadian. Those who said English or French made up another 11 million. Some of the smallest groups only had a few hundred, but 252 different ethnic identities in Canada. So this story of bilingualism and multiculturalism, when I was looking at our program of studies, I thought really, when I was in university taking history, some of my profs said, you can't narrow down history to certain individuals. It's all about forces that are really beyond the control of one person. And okay, yeah, there are definitely forces at work with large societies, but there are certain individuals who have an inexorable push on the society's direction. And in this case, there's one man who really was, without a doubt, the most influential on Canadian identity in the second half of the 20th century, and that was Pierre Elliot Trudeau. So this basically is the Pierre Elliot Trudeau show, because he was the one in power when Canada adopted both official bilingualism and multiculturalism. So we have to find out a little bit about him. To understand why he was doing this and why this was such a big deal, you have to go back to his childhood. So he was actually pretty much born into wealth and privilege. His father had a chain of gas stations, which he sold and made quite a lot of money. So basically they were millionaires. As a young man, even when he was your age, he traveled around Europe. So he was born in 1919. He would be 100 years old if he were still alive today. And so as a young man, he was actually traveling around Europe when the Nazis had just recently come to power in the early 1930s in Germany. And he got a sense of ethnic nationalism, how these different countries were really believing, oh, we're the best. And like the Germans saying, oh, we're superior, and everyone else pushed them down. So this had a really profound effect on him. As a young man, one of my favorite stories, I read his memoirs and a couple biographies about him. But when he was in his 20s, he was traveling throughout the Middle East, all throughout Asia. He was in Iraq, exploring some ancient ruins. And some Bedouins, these nomads, came up to him. And they kind of signaled, like, give us your watch. And he didn't have a watch, so he thought, oh, this is not good. But then he saw the knife that was in one of their belts. So he grabbed the guy's belt, right, or a knife right out of his belt, and said, no, let me see your knife. And basically chased these guys away. And that was basically a good summary of Pierre Trudeau's attitude. Even if you were threatening him with physical violence, he would not stand down. And so he was from Quebec. He was fluently bilingual. His father was French-Canadian. His mother was of British descent, so he would speak French at home to the father, English at home to his mother, so completely fluently bilingual. And so he was a trained lawyer, went to university. By the early 1960s, though, a lot of people in Quebec were getting upset. They said, you know what, we feel like English Canada has grown so much, French Canadians have been left behind, where is our place? And Pierre Trudeau, he did not really care for the idea that they believed that, oh, we're French, therefore we should be a different country. He believed that Quebec had a place in Canada. So he was often being interviewed about what he thought. He was not part of a political party at all. In fact, in the early 1960s, he and some friends said, well, we don't want to have anything to do with the Liberal Party because they had recently kind of changed their position. They were not in power at the time, but they just come to power. They had changed their position on accepting nuclear weapons. And they had reluctantly agreed with the Americans that, okay, Canada will have some nuclear weapons because you want us to have them. And Trudeau was very anti-nuclear weapons, so he said, nothing to do with them. But eventually, though, he was recruited. They said, we really need a guy like you with some of your fresh ideas. We'd like you to come and run for us. And you'll have a lot of influence. And so eventually he was persuaded to join the Liberals and run. And so he succeeded. So in the mid-1960s, he became the Justice Minister. So he presided over some really key changes, such as the legalization of homosexuality and abortion. Basically, if you were caught having romantic affairs and relations with someone of the same sex, you could actually go to jail back in this time. So he said, why is the country getting involved in that? He had said that the state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation. Meanwhile, the federal government was studying. They were studying bilingualism, and they were studying why are people in Quebec getting really upset? Because it was starting to be that they were actually talking about separating. And there was this one group, the FLQ, that actually started to commit acts of violence, like setting off bombs in mailboxes. And so there was this one fellow, René Lévesque. He was a journalist in Quebec, and as you can tell, he loved to smoke. And he was one of the key voices saying we should separate. And he actually formed this party, the Parti Québécois, a provincial Quebec party that still exists, that was dedicated to separatism. And so, unlike Pierre Trudeau, René Lévesque believed that, hey, we are an ethnic nation, French Canadians, we should have our own country. Pierre Trudeau believed, no, part of what makes Canada so unique and good is that it has our multitude of ethnicities. So eventually, the prime minister at the time, Lester Pearson, the Liberal prime minister, retired. And Pierre Trudeau ran for the leadership and won. He was extremely popular. It was called Trudeau Mania. There were all these young women rushing to kiss him and stuff like that, because that's what you do with aging politicians who are in their late 40s, right? And so one of the things that he did, one of his declarations that he had in 1969, so he came to power in 68, was to pass the Official Languages Act. Based on the recommendations of their studies. So basically saying that you have the right to federal government services in both French and English. So meanwhile, and he also declared, this is something that ticked off some of the people in Quebec. He said, we are multicultural in Canada. And because there were a lot of, in response to this bilingualism, these different ethnic communities like the Ukrainians and the Germans were saying, well, what about us? Where do we fit in all this? And he said, well, we are a multicultural nation and we celebrate all these different backgrounds. Canada is a place where you are free from discrimination. And he said, unlike that ethnic nationalism, saying we are best because of how we're born, he said that creates hatred, that creates prejudice. Canada is not based on ethnic pride, it is based on the values of love and compassion and peace. And so René Lévesque, he did not care for this. He said, we are not a nation of many different nations. We have two nations, he said. There's English and French. And I'm in the French nation, and because we're the French nation in Quebec, we should have our own country. And in fact, these FLQ terrorists, Lévesque was not a terrorist, but they actually kidnapped a couple of a Quebec provincial cabinet minister and a British diplomat, and they murdered Pierre Laporte, this Quebec cabinet minister. So Pierre Trudeau, he sent in the army. A lot of people criticized this. They said you're being too harsh because they were arresting people without charges or trial. But eventually they managed to round up these terrorists and punt them out. They were put in jail. And so that was how we dealt with this. So now Quebec separatism was peaceful, being done through politics. So meanwhile, we had later on, René Lévesque, he had an attempt. Pierre Trudeau actually was out of power for about 9 months. He lost an election, but he came back and he won again. It was just a brief interlude. And René Lévesque, he said, we're going to have a referendum to see once and for all, let the people of Quebec vote and see if we want to leave Canada. And so it was basically Trudeau versus Lévesque. And in one of Trudeau's most notable speeches, he didn't really think it was one of his better ones. People had been criticizing him because of his middle name, Elliot. They said, oh, you're not truly French Canadian because Elliot is an English Canadian name. And he said, the Elliot family, where that comes from with his mom's side, he said they've been in Quebec since the 1600s. It doesn't matter if you're English or you're French or you're something else. You're all equally Quebec. To be a Quebecois does not mean just to be French. And so he basically said, he talked about the Elliot family name. And this really resounded. It was very personal because Trudeau was very kind of aloof. He was kind of not an easy man to get to know. He didn't really bare his soul really kind of in the way that his son does now. And so this was sort of a moment of him opening up a bit. And in the referendum vote, the no side, saying no to separation, won 60% to 40%. So Lévesque was devastated. He was traumatized by this, that his big goal failed. But he said, we won't give up. We're going to separate one day. So Trudeau, meanwhile, he also, 2 years later, so 1980 was this referendum, he secured the final stage of Canadian independence by bringing home the Constitution Act of 1982. So by doing this and getting an agreement with all these premiers, except for René Lévesque, who is still Premier of Quebec and refused to sign, but he got them all to agree on how the new rules of Canada would run, and he signed it with the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II, and so now Canada can change its own constitution. So now we were fully independent. And he incorporated these ideas of multiculturalism, of bilingualism, of respect for human rights. All of these are entrenched in our charter. So any government, they can't just change this with a vote. If you wanted to get rid of protection against discrimination, you would need basically 70% of the population's worth of provincial legislatures to agree to this too. So really, if you want to make a change to the Constitution, it truly has to be in the best interests of the whole country to do that. So Pierre Trudeau basically left office eventually. Now, this is one of the reasons why some people grumble about Trudeau. Part of it is economically. These were very difficult times in the 70s and 80s. Some of the policies that he had in place to try to handle, the wildly rising and later falling prices of energy, chiefly among them, he struggled to do this, as pretty much every world leader did. And that's why, particularly today in Alberta, some people grumble about the Trudeau name. At the time, in 1984 now, he had been Prime Minister for a total of 16 years. And so this was actually the third longest reign after Mackenzie King and John A. Macdonald. And so he was getting unpopular. The economy was really struggling. He walked out. He said to the journalists, he said, "I was walking out in the snow and looking for signs of destiny, but I saw none, only snowflakes." And so he decided it was time to retire, and the Liberals were swept from office by a man named Brian Mulroney of the Progressive Conservative Party. So Brian Mulroney, he had his own goals. He had really opposed a lot of what Trudeau did and said. But Brian Mulroney had one key quest. Well, he had actually several, including free trade, but we're not talking about free trade right now. One of his goals, he said, "I'm going to succeed where Pierre Trudeau failed." You might remember that René Lévesque, who actually died then in 1987 from lung cancer, see those cigarettes, you don't want those. Mulroney said that Trudeau could not get Quebec to sign the Constitution. That does not mean Quebec doesn't have to play by those rules. It was more of a symbolic thing, saying Quebec, this is not good for Quebec. So he said, "I'm going to get Quebec to sign the Constitution." It seemed like he was in a good position to do this because after Lévesque lost this referendum, eventually his party was swept out of power. The Quebec Liberals were now in power, so they would really be more open to this. But they weren't just going to sign the signature to be nice. They said, we want some more recognition. You need to give us something in exchange for the signature. And so Brian Mulroney said, okay, we're willing to accept and officially state in the Constitution that Quebec is a distinct society, that Quebec is basically like a nation within a nation. And so the retired Pierre Trudeau, you can imagine, he said, we're one Canada. We have many cultures within Canada, but no, Quebec is Canada. So he was not really key on that. But Mulroney said, no, I'm going to give them that in exchange for them signing the Constitution. And in addition to that, Quebec wanted special powers. In order to get the other provinces to agree to these changes in the Constitution, he would have to give them extra powers too. So the provinces were really lining up. They said, ooh, this is going to be great. A lot of the premiers were on board. In fact, the new Liberal leader, John Turner, who had been the one who lost to Mulroney, he said, you know what, yeah, I think we can get on board with this. And so all these different provincial legislatures, they had to vote on whether it was called the Meech Lake Accord, whether they wanted the Meech Lake Accords of 1987 to pass. So this was taking years and years. This was like a top item in the news. And most of the legislatures were voting and saying, yes, we want Meech Lake. We want the federal government to give us these powers. Trudeau, he said, Mulroney, you're a weakling. You're a weakling for handing over all these powers. He said, this is going to be the end of Canada because the federal central government is not going to have any strength left. But it all came down, though, eventually. There was one key figure. His name was Elijah Harper, and he was a member of the Legislative Assembly in Manitoba. And he was First Nations. And he said that, you know what, you're giving all this stuff to the French Canadians, but you have not once in this whole process, Brian Mulroney, you have not consulted the First Nations. And why don't we get special rights and privileges? We were here first. And so he held on to an eagle feather. And during the debate in the Manitoba legislature, he just held on to it. He kept on holding on and just kept on delaying the debate. Eventually, the Premier of Newfoundland saw all these delays going on and he said, well, we can't wait forever. So they voted that down. There were some changes over these years to some of the other provincial governments that had once supported Meech Lake. And eventually, what seemed to be like a done deal failed. Because a lot of the First Nations across the country then, they said, yeah, we want to be consulted. And so Brian Mulroney, his attempt for Meech Lake was defeated. And his chance to get Quebec into the Constitution was gone. But he was not going to give up. So Brian Mulroney, he won a second election. So 1988, he won a second majority government, and he said, by God, I'm going to get Quebec's signature on this constitution, and I'm going to learn from the mistakes of Meech Lake. Not only that, I'm not going to just get the provinces to vote on this, I'm going to get the Canadian people to vote on this in a referendum. Let them decide. And this time we're going to invite the First Nations into the process. And so it seemed like it was going pretty well. It seemed like it was quite popular. He was going to once again, giving away a lot of federal powers to the provinces. But who should return? Who should return but Pierre Trudeau? Still retired, still not an elected official. It had been 8 years now since he was prime minister. It was now 1992. But Pierre Trudeau went to a Chinese restaurant. But this was not going to be just any regular dim sum. No siree. Pierre Trudeau basically gave a very passionate speech saying this Charlottetown Accord will be the end of Canada because you will just completely weaken us. You are going to basically make us easy to take over for the United States. And Canada, if Canada has to end at some point, Canada should go out with a bang. But you, Brian Mulroney, are going to make it go out with a whimper. And so the press, the newspapers were covering this speech he gave at this Chinese restaurant, and it was called La Maison de Egg Roll. And Pierre Trudeau, despite being out of power for so long, still carried so much influence that people started to think. They said, yeah, we don't want to completely restructure our country just to get Quebec's signature on the Constitution. And so in the following referendum, the Charlottetown Accord was defeated. A lot of people in Quebec were quite ticked off that they dragged on for years and years and years, all for nothing. And one of Brian Mulroney's chief Quebec lieutenants, Lucien Bouchard, left the party, left the Progressive Conservatives to form the Bloc Québécois. Brian Mulroney cursed the name of Pierre Trudeau for having pulled the rug out from under him, and he retired. He knew he was actually at the time, the most unpopular prime minister in Canadian history, and his successor, Kim Campbell, in the 1993 election, her party only won 2 seats, whereas they had once had well over 200. And that was basically the end of the Progressive Conservatives as a significant force until they would merge later with the Canadian Alliance to form the modern-day Conservative Party. So as for Pierre Trudeau, basically his vision of Canada as one country, where Quebec is a part of that country, and we see multiculturalism that we celebrate in all parts of Canada. That is now a reality. So despite all these debates, despite the controversy about, no, we should just be English Canadians, like back in the 70s, or in Quebec, we are just French Canadian, that is now a key part of our identity. In fact, in this last election, the only party, all the major parties now support multiculturalism. The Liberals, Conservatives, NDP, the Greens, they all say we support multiculturalism. The only one that didn't was the People's Party of Canada. And actually, even if you don't have any fingers, you can count how many seats they won. They won 0 seats. So it does show just how ingrained this idea of multiculturalism is. As for Pierre Trudeau, he was still, active and talked. He still worked at his law firm, kept busy. Very tragically, his son Michel, his youngest son, died in an avalanche when he was snowboarding in British Columbia in 1998. And so for the last couple of years of Pierre Trudeau's life, he was really grief-stricken. People said he was just not the same man after he lost his child. And so a couple of years later, then in the year 2000, he passed away. And I remember I was in 6th grade at the time, and I really didn't know anything about politics. I had heard the name of Pierre Trudeau, but I had no idea what he did. But I was aware even then that everyone was talking about it, this huge state funeral. It was at this state funeral where Justin Trudeau really first appeared on the national scene as someone people were talking about. He was only 28. And in his eulogy, it was because of his eulogy, he gave a very impassioned speech sharing some childhood stories. But he talked about how Pierre Trudeau came back, that he never left, that he kept coming back from Meech Lake. He kept coming back for Charlottetown to defend this idea of a Canada that is bilingual, that respects that is multicultural, and yet we are all united in one Canadian nation. We're not We're not placing one nation above or below any other. That's what Canada is about. It's not about who you were born as, it's about those values of love and compassion. But he said, to end it off, he said, but this time, no, Pierre Trudeau is not coming back anymore. So it's up to us. It's up to us to maintain that. And I know when I ask classes, who supports the idea of multiculturalism? Who supports, accepting people based on their ethnicity? About, respecting people of different religions, of different sexual orientations, and usually without an exception, everyone raises their hand, and yet we can't be complacent. We can't let our guard down. When I see students in journal entries sometimes write nasty things about other ethnic groups, seeing people say homophobic or write things on people's lockers, judging them based on that, whether or not it's even true. That's really harmful. When people mock other people's religious beliefs or lack thereof, we still have, a lot of dark parts to our society. And when we look at the things that really terrified Pierre Trudeau in Nazi Germany, the way that they were putting some people above or below others, we're still people. We're still human with our faults. It's something that we can still fall victim to. In fact, in Canada, up until 1983, there were still segregated schools where black and white people went to different schools in Nova Scotia. That was the last one that closed. So really, no, we're not so perfect as a society. We can't let our guard down. And so you can continue to do your part. When you see something that is bad that's being said or something that's happening, to speak out. If you don't know what to do, then go get help. Go talk to someone who can help. Because the dream is alive, and we've gone from our society. We see the change in Canada from the French and the English hating each other to a society where we have people of religious beliefs that would have been burned at the stake at the beginning of our course back in the 1500s, who are now being accepted, where our political leaders are celebrating them and going to their festivals. And that's a place where we have peace and we have love and compassion. And so ultimately, yes, it's wonderful to be proud of Oktoberfest or Kwanzaa, but ultimately, no matter who you are, if we can carry the peace, the love, and compassion into our lives and in the lives of those around us, that's how we can be good Canadians. And so that's something that Pierre Trudeau, not everyone agreed at the time. And, you can, of course, pick apart some of the policies economically or otherwise, but he really molded the values of this country by saying, no, we are bilingual, we are multicultural. The fact that people across the whole political spectrum, there's pretty much consensus that multiculturalism and bilingualism are positive things, it just shows an impact that the man had. So, I hope you can make your own impact on the lives of those around you. And you've made an impact on me with the kindness and the consideration that you've shown me in my first year and your first year at St. Gabriel the Archangel. It has been a true pleasure to teach you. And I don't say that lightly. And I hope you take very good care of yourselves and you have a wonderful summer. And I am just so excited for September because I've been sitting here for already over 2 months. So I feel like I've had enough. I've had enough time away from school, and I hope to see you very much, and may you carry love and compassion to those around you. Take care.